They didn't come for the land. They came for the silence they thought lived on it. In this gripping story, a quiet black farmer, once a legendary sniper, finds her peaceful life shattered when a ruthless private force targets her rural property, unaware of the storm she's ready to unleash. With every step they take, they trespass not just on her soil, but on her past. What happens when forgotten ghosts return wearing new faces? Before we go any further, tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's story cuts even deeper. Helen Hayward didn't tremble when the shovel struck something metallic underground. She just paused, tilted her head a little, and listened. The sound was too sharp for rock and too shallow for pipe. She tapped the blade of the shovel gently against the curved shape, her breath steady, her back straight, her worn gloves gripping the handle like it was part of her arm. She squatted slowly, knees popping, and ran her fingers through the damp soil until she uncovered the corner of an old tin canister. Not rusted, not new either. Her late husband, Jerome, had buried tools and jars like this around the farm years ago. Geology samples, mostly. She used to tease him about it, called them his ground secrets. But this one wasn't marked. No tape, no tag, no label. She hauled it out of the earth, wiped it with the edge of her flannel sleeve, and opened the lid. Inside were 2 test tubes sealed in wax and a folded piece of paper that hadn't touched sunlight in a decade. Her fingers paused at the crease of the paper. Not hesitation, calculation. Then she opened it, her dark eyes scanning quickly. It was a diagram. Soil levels, water lines, pressure points, and at the center, a hand-drawn circle marked Zone 3 Crystalline Shelf. She folded the paper back neatly and slid it into her coat pocket. One of the test tubes, the darker one, went into the other pocket. The canister? She reburied it. Too many curious eyes these days, too many trucks that didn't belong on county roads. She stood, no creak in her knees, no sigh from her lips. Then she walked back up the hill, her boots biting into the earth like they knew the way home. From the ridge she could see her entire spread. The main house, the barn, the chicken run, and the tree line that wrapped around the back fields like a coiled spine. The fence on the northern side needed mending, and the wind had knocked the scarecrow sideways, but everything else stood right where she left it, in perfect order. Her house looked modest at a glance. White clapboard, wide porch, tin roof, just 2 stories. But that porch swing could detect vibration from 20 feet away. The windows were shatter-resonant, the crawl space lined with sandbags, and the basement was dry, deep, and still smelled like gun oil. She never needed it to look like much. That was the point. No one visited, not even delivery drivers. She kept a P.O. box 2 towns over just to make sure her mail never crossed paths with her land. The nearest neighbor was a cattle rancher with Parkinson's who couldn't see 5 feet in front of him, and the closest paved road was half a mile east. She liked it that way. She earned it that way. Helen reached the porch and slipped her boots off at the mat. Inside everything was clean, symmetrical, quiet. The wood floor had been polished that morning. The blinds were open just wide enough to catch sun, but not wide enough to give away anything in return. The smell of cedar oil and soap lingered in the air, a sign of routine, not comfort. She put the test tube on the counter next to a lined notepad and wrote a single word beneath it: verify. Then she crossed the kitchen, opened the fridge, and poured herself a glass of water. No coffee. Not today. Her hands didn't need to shake. She sipped once and heard it, that distant crunch of tires on gravel. Not the mail route, too early. Not the rancher. He drove a diesel. This was smooth, weighted, and too quiet. Government issue or corporate? She placed the glass down, turned the blinds a notch, and stood still as the vehicle crept into view at the far end of her drive. White SUV. Shiny. Not local. Clean plates, no state stickers. That alone was enough for her pulse to slow, not quicken, as she reached beneath the sink and opened the latch to a hidden compartment. Inside, her fingers brushed canvas. No panic, no hesitation, just muscle memory. She removed the old case. Not a rifle, not yet. Just the spotting scope and a smaller pouch. She set them by the window and knelt, sighting through the glass just as the SUV rolled to a full stop near her gate. One man, mid-40-ish, Caucasian, hair too neat for someone used to work, elbows rolled, collar undone, flashy, casual, city-dominant. He didn't get out right away, just sat there for a second, as if calibrating the scene, like it was a boardroom. Helen didn't blink. When he finally stepped out, he walked like he thought the gravel owed him something. His smile arrived first, the kind built by practice, not honesty. He carried no folder, no device, just an envelope in one hand and that damn grin in the other. Helen opened the front door before he reached the porch. Not a word, just stood there, upright, arms at her side, watching. "Ms. Hayward," he said. She didn't confirm. "My name's Trevor Nash. I represent a firm with interests in rural development. We've identified a few key properties in the region, and yours happens to fall right in the middle of a very exciting opportunity. I'd love to talk to you about a potential offer." He extended the envelope. Helen didn't move. His smile twitched for just a second. "We understand the importance of legacy," he added, softening his tone. "You've clearly kept this land well. The firm I work for values stewardship. What we're offering is not just about money. It's about giving you freedom. Freedom to rest, to not have to worry about—" The envelope disappeared into her hand before he finished. She stepped back inside and closed the door. Didn't slam it. Didn't say a word. Trevor stood there blinking at wood grain for a full 10 seconds before turning back toward his vehicle. His smile didn't return until he reached the door handle. He didn't know why it mattered, but it did. Inside, Helen opened the envelope slowly. One sheet, heavy stock, gold lettering at the top. She read the number. She read the terms. Then she folded it back neatly and walked to the wood stove. The fire was already burning. She didn't stoke it, just opened the iron hatch, placed the offer inside and closed it. The edges curled black in seconds, a corner caught, then flared. The ink melted like tar. Helen watched until it turned to nothing. Then she turned back to the window. The SUV was already backing out, tires kicking up a thin cloud of dust. She waited until it disappeared around the bend before she moved again. When she did, it was not to sit, not to rest, but to pull a binder from the shelf labeled Wesley M., and behind that a second case, long, heavy. She didn't open it. Not yet, but her hand rested on it. Just for a moment. Like saying hello to an old friend. There was a point where the ground didn't feel like it belonged anymore. Helen stood at the northern field just after sunrise, boots buried ankle-deep in mud, and squinted at the ridge. The soil near the base had shifted, subtle like a pulled thread in a heavy quilt. To anyone else, it had looked like wind had made a mess, but Helen knew better. She stepped lightly across the furrow, moving where the ground dipped slightly. The same space Jerome used to say, "talk different," when you stomped on it. He'd walk it once a month, tapping the heel of his boot along the ridgeline like he was knocking on doors only the earth could answer. After he died, Helen had stopped checking that patch. For a while it had felt like superstition. Now she realized it had been habit. Training, even. She knelt again, palms brushing across the disturbed earth. Not the kind of shift made by cattle. No hoof prints, no scat. Something had been dug here, then covered. Not deep enough to be a full trench, just enough to probe. She followed the line 10 feet east until it ended abruptly near a patch of crabgrass that had begun to yellow. That was new, too. It hadn't been dry this week. No drought. No animals messing in that spot either. But the grass was brittle, curling at the edges. Helen reached into her vest and pulled out a small trowel. She dug slowly, gently, like peeling back skin without tearing it. Half an inch down, the dirt changed color. It was darker, almost slate-like, but soft. And then the smell hit her. Sharp, faintly acidic, not rot, not oil, synthetic. She didn't recoil. She just leaned closer and inhaled once. Then she stood, slid on her gloves again, and started collecting. 3 soil samples, one from the ridge base, one from the patch with dying grass, one from the clear line that looked like it had been dragged. She bagged each one, labeled the plastic with dates and coordinates, and sealed them into a small case. Then she headed back to the barn. The barn was a relic from her grandfather's time. Red siding faded to rust, white trim chipped in places, but it held together better than most of the homes in the county. She unlocked the padlock, stepped inside, and closed the doors behind her, eyes adjusting quickly to the light streaming through the loft window. There was a wooden workbench on the west wall, covered in tools most people forgot how to use. Above it hung a cabinet with double locks. She opened it with a key around her neck and placed the soil samples inside a lead-lined drawer, next to 5 other samples she'd collected over the past 4 months. The pattern was forming. Jerome had been right. Something was under them, something that didn't want to stay quiet. He used to talk about it late at night, when the stars came out and they'd sit by the porch drinking black coffee. He'd tell her about the fractures in the bedrock, about how certain places hummed if you knew what frequency to feel for. She'd tease him, call it earth ghosts. He'd smile and say, maybe, but he'd also say the land was old, and old land kept secrets because no one ever asked the right questions. Before he died, he'd left her a few notebooks. Nothing dramatic, just his thoughts. Geological logs, elevation shifts, mineral vein theory. Helen had kept them in a fireproof case in the closet, right behind her discharge papers. Most of it had felt like nostalgia, until the trucks started showing up. Now she pulled those notebooks out again. They were still wrapped in waxed paper, still smelling faintly of cedar and graphite. She sat down at the table beside the window, opened the one labeled Volume 3, and traced her finger down to the section with the circled heading, Ridge Shelf, Unstable Composition. The pages were full of sketches and calculations she'd never had to understand before. But the angles were familiar. The coordinates matched the soil samples, and there, underlined twice, was a note. Depth, estimated 19.6 m, crystalline bands. That meant pressure, and where there was pressure, there were interests. She closed the notebook and pulled out a small burner phone from the drawer. 1 number saved, no name, just a code. She dialed. The man who answered didn't say hello. North Ridge has been disturbed, she said plainly. Pause. Then, how deep? Enough to breach, but they're testing. They want confirmation before they drill. Another pause. You need a survey. I need silence, and I need documents, full mineral rights. You sure? Helen looked out the window. The scarecrow still leaned sideways. The tree line looked ordinary, but she knew better. Yeah, give me 72 hours. Make it 48. She hung up. The man didn't argue. Helen leaned back in the chair, the creak of old wood echoing faintly. Her hand brushed the pistol under the table, checked the chamber by feel alone, and set it back down. She'd never fired it in this house, not once. But the silence outside didn't feel honest anymore. At noon the wind shifted. Clouds rolled in low, dragging the scent of something chemical across the eastern field. Helen stepped out and stood under the porch awning, sniffing once. Her eyes narrowed. She checked the well spigot, turned it. Water flowed. Clean. Clear. She let it run, caught a handful, sniffed. A hint of it, barely there. But there. She filled a mason jar, sealed the lid, and wrote East Run in black marker on the cap. That evening she walked the perimeter with her dog tags around her neck and a single flare in her pocket. Just in case. The fence was intact. The gates locked. But the grass along the north ridge had tracks now. Not tire tracks, but boot prints. 4 pairs, worn lightly. Someone had tried to tread soft. She reached the corner post where Jerome had carved a notch for every year they'd owned the land. 43 notches. The last one was hers. She touched it once, then traced a fresh mark just below the last. Smaller. Sharper. She didn't carve it, but someone had. She went back to the house as the sun disappeared behind the ridge. Inside, she turned off every light but the one above the stove. Then she sat at the kitchen table, spread out the soil samples, the jar of water, and the pages of Jerome's notes. She wasn't thinking about the trucks, or the boots, or the man with the smile. She was thinking about pressure, and how sometimes the ground didn't give way because it was weak. Sometimes it gave way because it was warning you. Helen folded her arms on the table and stared at the map. And she waited. Trevor Nash didn't like the countryside. Too many silences. Too many things you couldn't control. Weather. Animals. People who didn't talk enough. Out here, respect was measured in patience, not power. That didn't sit well with Trevor. He liked rooms that buzzed with air conditioning and fake sincerity. He liked people who talked too much because it made them easier to read. His tailored jacket didn't belong out here either, nor did his shoes. Dust clung to them, stubborn and red, as if the land wanted to mark him before he got the chance to mark it himself. He had driven slow up the long gravel road leading to Helen Hayward's house, pretending it was out of courtesy. In truth, he didn't like the way the trees hung low over the road like they were judging him. He also didn't like that his GPS lost signal about 3 miles back. That always made him twitchy. Still, he smiled when the house came into view. Modest. That was the word developers used when they saw something they wanted to tear down. One of the porch rails was cracked. The paint had faded to a dull whisper. Trevor saw weakness in every inch. He adjusted his collar and took the envelope from the passenger seat. The paper was heavy, the seal embossed. The number inside would be more than she'd ever seen on one check. That, to Trevor, was generosity. But he knew not everyone saw it that way, especially folks like her. He stepped out of the SUV, closing the door gently, as if the wrong tone might set something off. A breeze picked up, brushing his hair just enough to be annoying, and he smoothed it back as he walked. The gravel crunched under his feet, and he glanced at the windows, trying to guess where she might be watching from. People like Helen didn't just let you walk up without a good look. He'd read her file. Military widow. No kids. No records of travel, no debts, no recent medical expenses. Woman like that could be reasoned with, if you knew the right angle. When he reached the porch, the door opened before he could knock. She didn't say anything. She didn't smile. She didn't even blink. Trevor launched into the kind of monologue he'd given 100 times, smoothing his voice like satin. She didn't interrupt, but she didn't nod either. He held out the envelope like it was a peace offering. She took it without a word. Then the door closed. He blinked at the wood, unsure if that counted as progress. Back in the car, he typed a note into his phone. Initial contact made. Target is guarded. Possible negotiation route uncertain. As he backed out of the long drive, he kept one hand on the wheel and the other on the gear shift. He didn't look back. Helen watched him from the second-floor window. When his car disappeared around the bend, she descended the stairs slowly. She placed the envelope on the counter beside her water jar, her hands steady. She hadn't opened it yet. She didn't need to. She knew exactly what was inside and what it meant. She stood for a while in the quiet. Let the wind brush the porch. Let the dust settle. Then she slid the envelope into the drawer beneath the stove and pulled out an old folder wrapped in twine. Inside were copies of her land deeds, original mineral rights documentation, letters from the county registrar dated and stamped. She checked them one by one, then added the envelope to the stack. After tying the folder shut again, she moved to the stove. The fire had burned low. She opened the iron door and slid in the envelope. This time she watched. The flames took their time, curling the paper slowly before devouring it. The gold lettering blistered first. Then the seal peeled away like old paint. The check inside darkened, folded in on itself, then vanished. Only ash remained. Helen shut the door. That night she went out to the porch after midnight. The wind was colder than usual, and the moon hung low over the ridge. She sipped water from a tin cup and listened. Crickets. Distant owls. Nothing else. But then she heard faint. The sound of a car slowing near her southern fence. No lights. She waited, listening to the tires roll to a stop, the soft click of a door opening. They didn't approach. She gave it 20 minutes. Then she reached under the porch bench, opened the concealed compartment, and lifted out the case. Not the long one. Not yet. She opened the smaller case, checked the pistol inside, and walked barefoot down the gravel path toward the barn. Her steps were slow, deliberate, her shadow long. She reached the edge of the field before she saw it, just the top of a dark vehicle behind the tree line. No movement, no sound. She knelt slowly, rested one hand in the dirt, and waited. After 10 more minutes, the door opened again. A figure stepped out. Too far to see clearly, but the posture was wrong. Not local, too smooth, too careful. She watched him place something on the ground, a small black box. Then he turned and got back in the vehicle. The car rolled away without headlights. She didn't move until it was gone. Then she walked toward the spot. The box was small, square, unmarked. She crouched beside it and opened the lid with the edge of her knife. Inside, a digital recorder. Already playing. A voice came through, smooth, theatrical. "Ms. Hayward, I'm hoping you'll reconsider our offer. What you have under your land, it's not just valuable. It's necessary for energy, for progress. We'd like to help you transition away from the burden of responsibility. Let us take care of it." The voice paused. "We're not here to take anything, but if you won't sell, others might not be so polite." Helen stood. She carried the box back with her, set it on the porch beside her boots. Then she stepped inside and locked the door. The next morning she drove to town for the first time in weeks. Not to shop, not to chat. She parked 2 blocks from a dusty law office with a peeling sign, Monroe and Chase, LLP. Inside, the air smelled like old paper and spilled coffee. The receptionist glanced up. "Can I help you?" "I need to see Wesley," Helen said. "He's not." "Tell him it's Helen Hayward." The receptionist hesitated, then stood and walked to the back. 10 seconds later, Wesley Monroe emerged from a door with a crooked tie and tired eyes. "Helen?" He blinked. "God, I thought you were—" "I need mineral documentation, water rights, zoning papers. Every inch of legal ownership this land allows." Wesley stepped forward, mouth half open. "I thought you—" "48 hours," she said. "Helen, what happened?" "They made an offer." She looked him square in the face. "I lit it on fire." 3 days passed without another word. No envelope, no recording, no vehicles on the driveway. But Helen knew better than to take silence for peace. She'd learned long ago that men who spoke loud before rejection rarely disappeared after it. They just got quieter, smarter, meaner. The barn door creaked as she slid it open, letting the light pour across the floorboards. Dust danced in the air. She set her toolbox down, unlocked the storage hatch beneath the grain bin, and lifted out a coil of old fiber cable she hadn't touched since her last fence install 6 years ago. Next to it lay a black plastic case with a thumbprint scanner and worn grip tape. She didn't open it, not yet. But her fingers brushed the surface, a quick greeting, like muscle memory preparing itself. Outside, she began the circuit around the property, walking the perimeter fence from the northwest post. The wire was still taut, posts still upright, sensors buried every 30 feet just under the first layer of dirt. Motion triggers, seismic flags. Nothing flashy, nothing digital, all analog, hardwired. Untraceable unless you were trained to notice the clues. By the time she reached the north ridge, the sun was high. The wind was soft today. Too soft. It barely stirred the trees. Helen crouched by a corner post. 2 of the sensor flags had tilted, leaning slightly toward the ridge. One of the screws in the base plate was scuffed, as if someone had brushed it with a boot. Not enough to leave a full print, but enough to say someone had tested their luck here. She ran her hand along the post, then stood and scanned the tree line with her eyes. Nothing moved, but she could feel it. Eyes. She didn't look around suddenly, she just turned and walked the long way home. That night the dogs barked down in the canyon. Wild ones, not hers. She hadn't kept a dog since 2012. Too much noise, too many variables. But the coyotes barking that night had a different pitch to them. Frantic, uncertain, like something foreign had stepped across their territory. Helen sat on the porch with the lights off and a cup of cold coffee in her hands. She wore a dark hoodie and jeans, blending into the shadows as she watched the tree line. The rifle lay across her lap, bolt open, rounds in her coat pocket. The night creaked around her, every cricket's pause becoming a possible footfall. Then, just before 2 a.m., a flicker. Not a light, a shadow. To the left of the old windmill, something passed in front of the sky. Brief, maybe a second, but enough for her to register height, weight, and gait. Human, moving fast, knees bent. She stood slowly, set the cup down on the railing, and slipped back into the house. The hallway lights remained off. Her hand found the keypad beside the coat closet. 3 taps, a pause, 2 more. The old panel clicked open. Inside was a screen, grainy, black and white, connected to 6 analog motion cams placed discreetly around the perimeter. Most showed trees, fences. 1 showed movement. Camera 5, east side. Near the drainage culvert. Figures. They weren't walking. They were crouching, creeping along the fence like they expected it to be electrified. Helen reached above the screen and flipped the switch marked IR Net. A soft hiss confirmed the activation of the invisible grid. Not enough to harm, but enough to give a static shock to anyone who got too close. A second later, 1 figure on the monitor recoiled suddenly and dropped to 1 knee. The other stopped and pulled him back behind a tree. Helen reached for the transmitter beside the panel and pressed the button marked Record. No sirens, no spotlights. She just wanted the footage. Let them think they were still invisible. At sunrise, she found fresh tire tracks near the edge of the east field. Not deep, narrow tread. Probably a trail bike or ATV. Smart enough to keep off the road, dumb enough to leave a trail. She knelt beside the tracks and pressed her fingers into the dirt. Still damp. Maybe 2 hours old. She stood and looked across the field, all the way to the far fence where the land dipped toward the ravine. Somewhere out there, someone had camped, watched, waited. She would wait longer. Back in the house, she brewed fresh coffee and called Wesley. "Foot traffic last night," she said, skipping hello. "At least 2, East Ridge. Cameras caught them. I'll pull the tapes. You want to notify the sheriff?" There was a pause. "You sure?" "I'm not interested in warnings. I'm interested in leverage." "I've filed the mineral rights claim," Wesley said, his voice tight. "Expedited. It's technically legal, but the zoning commission might push back. I'm trying to keep it quiet, but if they catch wind, it'll get dirty fast." "It's already dirty. They have lobbyists, Helen. Resources. If they want that land, they won't stop." "I haven't stopped either," she said, and hung up. She spent the afternoon mapping sightlines from the porch roof. The land rose gently toward the northern ridge, then sloped sharply into dense woodland. To the untrained eye, it looked peaceful, but Helen could still see the old defense lines she and Jerome had walked out together years ago. Crossfire angles, blind spots, natural traps. The land remembered what it had been prepared for. Near sunset, she unpacked her old duffel. Inside, an M24 rifle disassembled but oiled, a telescopic sight still pristine, 3 boxes of match-grade ammo, a cloth-wrapped journal marked ballistics. She laid everything out on the kitchen table. Not to reminisce. The first shot wouldn't be a warning. It would be a promise. That night, she didn't sleep in her bedroom. She slept on the floor near the back door, one ear pressed to the boards, the rifle laid across her arms like a memory returned. She didn't dream. She didn't need to. She already knew what was coming. Wesley Monroe hadn't worn a tie in 3 years, but that morning, as he stood in front of his office mirror trying to flatten his collar with the edge of his hand, he felt a familiar tightness creeping up the back of his neck. The tie sat on the desk beside him like a dare. He didn't pick it up. Instead, he smoothed his sleeves, took one last look at his reflection, and muttered under his breath, "She's gonna eat me alive if I screw this up." He hadn't heard from Helen Hayward in over 5 years. Not a call, not a card, not even a bill of inquiry. But when she walked into his office the other day with that look in her eye, that cold, surgical calm, it was like stepping into a memory he didn't want to revisit. She had said 48 hours. Wesley had been around enough contracts, enough scared farmers and desperate ranchers to know what a countdown sounded like. And he also knew that when Helen Hayward gave you a clock, you didn't run from it. You raced to beat it. He gathered the documents, old deeds, archived mineral filings, preemptive legal drafts, and stacked them carefully in the leather folder, embossed with her initials, H.H., in faded gold. He'd had it made for her once, back when he thought gifting legal accessories was clever. She'd barely glanced at it then. He figured she still wouldn't. As he stepped into his car, he checked the rearview mirror twice. Not paranoia, just old instincts. Helen's land had always stirred interest, but never like this. What worried him wasn't the offer she'd burned. It was the fact that someone had delivered it personally. Men like Trevor Nash didn't leave glass towers unless the dirt was gold underneath. The drive out to Helen's was quiet, the kind of quiet that didn't relax you. Too much static in the air, too many spaces for men to hide and wait. When he pulled up the long gravel road and saw her standing at the porch with a pair of binoculars in hand, he felt the old feeling return, like standing at the edge of a range waiting for someone to call wind speed. She didn't wave. She didn't move, just lowered the binoculars and turned toward the door. He parked, grabbed the folder, and walked up slow. When he reached the porch, the screen door opened before he could knock. "Clock's ticking," Helen said, stepping aside. "You always this welcoming? You always this late?" Wesley smiled, but it didn't stick. He handed her the folder. "Everything's inside. Mineral rights, water access, land use protections. I had to bend the county clerk's arm to keep it quiet. It won't hold forever." Helen opened the folder, flicked through the papers like she was reading a grocery list. No mistakes? Not the kind I'd survive, Wesley said. She gave him a look. Just a look, but it landed like a bullet. All right then, she muttered, setting the folder down and walking to the sink. Wesley stayed standing. You know, he said, glancing around the kitchen. This place looks exactly the same. Tightly clean. That's not what I meant. She poured 2 glasses of water and handed him one. No coffee? No time, she replied. He took a sip, then leaned against the counter. They're not just sniffing around for oil, Helen. I checked the filings from a partner company linked to Nash's firm. They're running test drills 2 counties over. Same soil structure. Same shelf line. Word is, they hit a crystalline deposit. Some rare composite. Helen didn't blink. Explains the trucks. I pulled the permit on one of them. Registered to a dummy company based in Nevada. No employees, no contact info. Just a fax number and a mailbox. They're testing, quietly. Yeah, they're preparing to trespass, loudly. Helen set her glass down. I want to file defensive claim. Lock it down. Make it known. Wesley nodded slowly. That'll draw attention. He looked at her carefully, trying to gauge just how deep she was willing to dig. You want a fight? I want the truth on paper before someone tries to steal it out from under me. He didn't answer right away. Then he said, You remember Fort Keller? Helen's jaw tightened slightly. Don't bring that up. I was there too, remember? I know what it's like to sit on something valuable while men in suits circle like vultures. You think you can control it. You can't. Not alone. I'm not alone. You got a neighbor I don't know about? Helen gave him a look. Not hard, not angry. Just sharp enough to end the line of questioning. I've got time, I've got range, and I've got leverage. Wesley swallowed. He took a deep breath and shifted his weight. You got cameras? Everywhere that matters. Gun safe. You asking or warning? He didn't answer. Helen turned toward the cabinet under the stairs and pulled out a smaller manila envelope. She handed it to him. All day? What's this? Evidence. Motion sensor footage. Soil analysis. Water contamination markers. He opened it and frowned. You took samples? Been taking them for months, Jerome started before he passed. He thought something was under the ridge. Wesley nodded, flipping through the images and printed notes. This is enough to start a claim, maybe more. Helen stepped out onto the porch and waited. Wesley followed. The sun hung low behind the ridgeline, casting long shadows across the fields. There's been movement in the trees, she said. 2 men last night. Quiet, trained, testing the perimeter. Think they'll come back? I always do. Wesley exhaled slowly. I'll have the claim filed before dawn. But, Helen... She turned. He stopped. You know what happens when you draw blood first. I didn't say anything about blood. No. But I can see it in your eyes. Helen stepped back into the house, her silhouette framed by the doorway. She didn't respond. Wesley stood there for a moment longer, then turned and walked to his car. As he pulled away, headlights off until he hit the main road, he glanced in the mirror and whispered, God help the poor bastard that tries her. Helen woke up with her hand already gripping the stock of the rifle. The sound was too clean to be wind. Not a coyote, not the house creaking. It was movement, deliberate, crisp. A branch breaking beneath pressure but held in check, like whoever stepped on it was hoping it wouldn't make a sound. It was just after 3:00 a.m., and the house was wrapped in the thick, dark silence that settles over land too far from town to be noticed. No lights on the horizon, no moon, just a heavy sky and a field full of secrets. She stayed still, listening. There, another shift, east side, close to the equipment shed. She slid from the floor silently, feet already bare, and moved across the boards like water. The rifle was already loaded, scope adjusted, safety off. She moved to the window, facing the rear field, and knelt, setting the barrel gently on the cushioned brace she had stitched into the sill years ago. Through the scope, the darkness shimmered. Then, a silhouette broke the black. Low, fast, and wrong. Too large for an animal, too smooth for a ranch hand. She adjusted the focus. Another figure moved just behind the first. Both were dressed in dark tactical gear, knees bent, steps practiced. They weren't just walking through the field. They were staging. Helen's breath slowed. Her pulse didn't rise. If anything, it quieted, like her body was stepping into an old uniform that fit too well. She turned the rifle just a hair to the left. One of them had paused near the irrigation pipe, pulling something from his belt. She saw the faint glow of a screen. A scanner. They were checking layout, distances, mapping her land. She clicked her tongue once, not loud, just enough to pull her mind back from where it was trying to go. There were too many questions to ask right now, and only one answer that would buy her time. She reached for the brass shell in her pocket, a tracer round, old but dependable, marked with a red ring near the base. She slid it in, chambered it, and turned the scope skyward, above the tree line. Then she pulled the trigger. The shot cracked through the night like lightning through silence. The tracer streaked upward, a sharp red line slicing across the stars before vanishing. It was loud enough to wake every living thing in the canyon. Dogs barked, crows scattered from the trees, something large crashed through brush in a panic. But it was the silence that followed that mattered most. Both figures froze. She watched them through the scope. One crouched low, the other turned, scanning with a small night vision monocular, unsure of where the shot had come from. Their body language shifted, no longer in control, now reactive, now unsure. They weren't prepared for her, not yet. She stayed at the window for 30 minutes after they left. They didn't run. They retreated. Fast, careful, back through the tree line to whatever road or vehicle had brought them. She didn't try to follow. She already knew they'd be back. By the time dawn broke, Helen was at the table with a fresh map spread across the wood. It was hand-drawn, annotated in red pencil, with elevation marks and blind spots traced in tight lines. She placed 2 stones on the map to mark where the intruders had crossed. One near the equipment shed, the other just west of the water line. Next to those she wrote in block letters, "Recon line, not first wave." She turned on the small battery-operated radio she kept for weather and emergency reports. Nothing out of the ordinary, no alerts, no chatter. Whoever had sent those men didn't want a fight, not yet. They wanted a scan. Measure. A chance. Helen wasn't giving them any. She sat back, then reached for the small lockbox under the table. She unlocked it with a key from around her neck and took out a sealed plastic bag. Inside was a black USB drive. She hadn't touched it in over a year. Jerome had given it to her a week before he died. He never told her what was on it, only that it wasn't to be plugged into anything unless she was absolutely sure the fight had come home. She didn't plug it in now, but she set it on the table beside the map like a loaded weapon waiting to be cocked. Just in case. Mid-morning, she made the drive into town. Not to speak, not to shop, just to be seen. Let word spread that she was still present, still quiet, still calm. She stopped at the feed store, bought nails, wire, a new bolt cutter. Things no one would question. Things people in small towns always bought. "Building something, Miss Hayward?" the clerk asked. She didn't answer. She paid in cash, loaded the truck herself, and drove home without stopping. At noon, she pulled the cameras. All 6 had captured the movement. Good resolution, clean silhouettes, time-stamped. She transferred the clips to an offline laptop, labeled the files, and burned 3 copies to separate disks. When she slid into a manila envelope marked Wesley Backup, one went into the barn safe. The third? She put that one in her coat pocket. By evening, she was back on the porch, cleaning her sidearm with careful, rhythmic strokes. The wind was heavier than the night before. It carried dust and silence together. She liked that. Silence wasn't peace, but it was honest. A pickup truck rolled past the base of her road around 7:00 p.m. Too slow, not local. Windows tinted. She wrote down the plate. Didn't bother calling the sheriff. Sheriff Briggs was a good man, but good men got pressured. He had a wife, a daughter, a mortgage, and Helen didn't need him getting caught in the crossfire of something she was already handling. She didn't want heroes. She wanted accountability. That night, she sat in the same floor spot near the back door, rifle against the wall, feet planted, back straight. But this time, she kept the tracer rounds within reach. One had spoken. The rest would shout. The box hadn't been opened in 14 years. Helen kept it in the crawl space under the floorboards, behind the stacked jars of pickled beets and canned beans, covered in an old army blanket, sealed with weatherproof tape, and nested inside a crate that hadn't been moved since Jerome passed. She knelt on the floor at dawn, the board still cold under her knees, and pulled the crate out with both hands, her knuckles cracked. Her breath stayed steady. There was no ceremony, no whispered prayer, no music swelling in the background like a movie. Just wood scraping against wood and the quiet click of the latch. Inside the box was the life she'd buried, folded tight. Her old BDUs, battle dress uniform, still smelled of oil and desert dust. The patches were worn, but still readable. Hayward across the chest. Left shoulder, an eagle claw stitched in gold. Right shoulder, a faded black insignia of her old unit, one that no longer officially existed. She took the uniform out gently, like handling bones. Underneath it lay her tags, a laminated ID badge, and 2 notebooks, one filled with call signs, the other with numbers and names she never wrote in ink. She lifted the rifle from the bottom of the box. Not the M24. This one was older, sleeker, heavier. The barrel was engraved, faint, just inside the chamber, with 3 initials, J.R.H. Jerome's handwriting. He'd given it to her before her last tour. She ran a cloth along the bolt and whispered, "Still straight." She set the weapon on the table and sat back. The silence in the house shifted. Not colder, not louder, just heavier. That rifle had seen things. She had seen things. In the hot sand outside Kandahar, through the fogged lens on a rooftop in Fallujah, in the brush along a border she still wasn't allowed to name. Missions that didn't exist. Targets whose deaths weren't recorded. Quiet wars fought in shadows. She'd been part of a 3-woman sniper team known in rumor as the Silence Crew. No medals, no press, just silence. Ruthless efficiency in places where American flags weren't welcome. And Helen? Helen had been the one they called Ghost Tooth, because when she bit down, you never saw it coming. She closed her eyes and breathed once, letting the dust of those years settle in her lungs. Then she stood. It was time to visit the past. She drove out to an abandoned lookout tower 10 miles south of her land. Built during a failed fire prevention program, the tower had been left to rot for over a decade. No one went there. No one remembered it existed. Except Helen. She parked a quarter-mile out, walked the rest of the way with her gear slung over her back and her rifle wrapped in canvas. The sun broke through the clouds halfway up the climb, turning the horizon into a smear of gold and ash. At the top, the old platform groaned beneath her boots, but it held. She knelt, laid out her gear, and sighted in the rifle. There it was, her land. From this height, it stretched out like a living map. The roof of her house, the barn, the east field, the ridge, the tree line, every corner she had memorized was laid bare beneath her. Maggie knew they had to stay high. Her innocence would probably be to neglect her big brother, which would cripple him. She couldn't let him grow up. She adjusted the scope, zoomed in on the tree line. Movement. 2 men, not close, surveying. They weren't amateurs anymore. These ones were checking terrain, looking for entry points. One pointed. The other made a note on a tablet. They moved slowly, methodically. She could take them now. Easy. The shot would land center chest, no time to scream. But that wasn't the mission today. Today was about proof. She clicked the small camera mounted beside her scope and snapped stills. Time-stamped, high-res, enough to hold up in court if anyone still believed in that kind of thing. When the men disappeared into the trees, she packed up and descended the tower. Back home, she transferred the photos onto a fresh drive, labeled it Ridge Activity 2, Daylight Ops. She placed it in a second manila envelope and wrote a name across the top, Sheriff Darnell Briggs. Helen hadn't spoken to Briggs in 2 years. Last time was over a boundary dispute involving a gas company that accidentally moved their drilling by 40 yards. She'd stopped it. He didn't ask how, but he'd respected her after that. She got in the truck and drove into town just after sunset. She didn't walk in the front door of the station. She left the envelope in the drop box meant for license renewals. No note, no call. Just enough to make him look. She drove back with her lights off until she hit the dirt road. When she returned, something was off. It was too quiet. Not in the fields, but in her bones. She stepped out, rifle in hand, and walked the perimeter of the house. That's when she saw it. Near the south fence, hanging from a rusted nail, was a ribbon. Who explains it? Tied in a single loop. It hadn't been there before. She approached carefully, eyes sweeping the ground for footprints. Nothing fresh, nothing heavy, just the ribbon fluttering slightly in the breeze. She reached out and untied it. Underneath, scratched into the post with the edge of something sharp, were 3 letters. D.C. Dean Coulter. That name hadn't touched her ears in a long time. She whispered it once. It tasted like metal. Coulter had been her superior in Afghanistan, a captain with too many scars and not enough soul. He was tactical brilliance fused with recklessness. He believed collateral damage was just the price of progress, and the last time she'd seen him, he was being pulled from a burning Humvee with blood in his eyes and a grin on his lips. He wasn't dead, and now he was here. Helen turned toward the house slowly, the ribbon still clenched in her fist. She didn't shake, but her pulse ran hot in her ears. Coulter didn't work for companies. He trained men who disappeared, and if he was marking her fence, it wasn't a threat, it was a challenge. She went back inside and opened the case again. This time, she laid out every round she owned, counted them, cleaned them, lined them up. She looked at the wall, at the old photograph of her and Jerome in their uniforms, smiling beneath a banner that read, "We keep what we earn." She touched the frame gently. Then she whispered, "He brought wolves." And the ghost in her uniform answered, "Then we hunt." The knock came hard. 2 short raps, then silence. Not the sheriff, not Wesley, and definitely not Coulter's kind. Helen waited behind the door with her palm flat against the wood, listening. It was 9:27 p.m. The porch light was off. She hadn't been expecting anyone, which meant whoever stood out there either made a mistake or was in trouble. A second knock. lighter this time, followed by a voice. Young, shaking. "Ma'am, please." That was enough. Helen cracked the door with one foot wedged behind it, hands still behind her back gripping the pistol. All stood on the porch. No older than 25, hair tied back under a torn hoodie, skin pale with a sheen of sweat on her brow, mud on her jeans, a gash across one knuckle. She wasn't armed, or if she was too scared to use it. Helen said nothing. The girl took a breath like it might be her last. "My name's Kayla Rivers. I think they're following me. I didn't know where else to go." Helen didn't open the door wider. "What makes you think I'm safer than anyone else?" she asked. Kayla swallowed. Her eyes didn't flinch. "Because you're the only one who scared them." That earned her 1 second of silence. Then Helen opened the door and stepped aside. "Don't touch anything." Kayla stepped in, chest rising and falling like she'd just finished a sprint. She hovered near the entryway, eyes darting around the room, cataloging everything like someone who expected a trap door to open at any moment. Helen locked the door and walked past her without a word, motioning toward the table. Kayla followed. "Sit." She obeyed. Helen placed a glass of water in front of her. "Look." Kayla took one sip, set the glass down, and then pulled something from inside her hoodie. A folded map, not printed. Hand-drawn. Lines in black ink, notes scribbled in red. Helen took it carefully, unfolded it, and stared. The map was detailed, too detailed. Topography lines traced with mathematical precision. Labels like Zone Alpha and Extraction 1A dotted the page. Helen's property was boxed in thick red marker. A circle drawn directly over her northern ridge read, "Target, Crystalline Core." "What is this?" Helen asked. "I used to work with them," Kayla said, her voice trembling slightly. "The development firm. Nash's team. I was a geological analyst. Intern. I thought it was about green energy, new mining tech. Renewable crystal lattice structures, they called it. Sounded cutting edge." Helen's eyes never left the map. "They had us running data models based on land samples, satellite scans, most of it above board. But then a few months ago they gave us a new task. Predict mineral density beneath privately owned land, especially parcels with old rights not yet transferred." Helen touched the red circle. "That's not a guess." Kayla nodded. "They know exactly what's under your ridge. It's not just valuable, it's rare, like world market disruption rare." Helen folded the map and tapped it twice against the table. "So why are you here?" Kayla looked down. "I ran a background trace on some of the test sites they were sending data from. I saw your name, recognized the layout from previous assignments. When I asked questions, they locked me out of the system." Helen watched her closely. "I snuck into the data lab, pulled a few files, tried to contact a lawyer I knew from school. The next morning my apartment was tossed. No sign of forced entry. Laptop gone, and 2 men started following me in a black SUV. And you thought leading them here was smart?" Kayla's voice cracked. "No, I ditched them outside of town. Took the back roads, hid in a cornfield. I doubled back twice. I don't think they know I made it here." Helen leaned back in her chair. "You better pray you're right." She stood, walked to the kitchen cabinet, and pulled out a clean folder. She slid the map inside and sealed it. Then she picked up her radio and clicked twice. Wesley answered immediately. "We've got a witness." Kayla Rivers, intern, claims internal mapping confirmed what's under the ridge. Wesley let out a slow breath. "Do I need to come out there?" "No, but get ready to file whistleblower status if we need it. She's got documents." "Okay, keep her safe." Helen clicked the radio off and turned back to Kayla. "You're not sleeping in the house." Kayla blinked. "What?" "If they followed you, even a scent trail, they'll expect you inside. You'll stay in the storm cellar. One way in, no windows, reinforced walls. I'll lock it from the outside." Kayla nodded, fear crawling back into her eyes. But she didn't argue. Helen walked her to the back of the house with one hand on the flashlight and the other still near the pistol. They moved fast across the yard. The wind had picked up, tugging at the trees in angry whispers. The storm cellar was buried into the slope behind the barn. Inside it was cold and dry. A cot, a lantern, 2 gallons of water. "Enough?" Helen pointed to the corner. "Sleep with your back to the wall. Don't open the door unless I knock 3 times. Kayla nodded again. "Thank you." Helen stared at her a second longer. "You better be telling the truth, Kayla." "I am." Helen shut the door and slid the bolt. Then she climbed the ridge. She took her rifle, a pair of binoculars, and a flare. She waited there for hours, watching the road. And just after midnight, headlights flashed once in the distance, then disappeared. No engine, no horn, just a flash. A signal. Helen's hand didn't shake as she reached for the flare. No reason. It shouldn't have lighted yet. But she pulled the cap off. The time for hiding was almost over. The first thing Helen noticed was the wind. It wasn't the usual dry whisper skimming the tall grass. It was still, pressed down, like something in the air had stopped breathing. She could smell it, too. Metal, diesel, and the sour scent of sweat on men who hadn't showered in days. She laid flat along the ridge, face streaked with dust, one eye behind the scope, the other scanning, blind. The darkness clung to the trees like a second skin. It was 2:13 a.m., and they were coming. They didn't howl, didn't shout. This was not the kind of gang that needed to make noise. These were the Ridge Unit. 6 men moved in coordinated arcs across her eastern fence line, dressed in matte gear, rifles slung low, NVGs strapped tight to their faces. They weren't stumbling through her land. They were ghosting through it. She watched them breach the outer gate, using bolt cutters wrapped in fabric to muffle the snap. One of them raised 2 fingers, pointed toward the barn. Another circled right, headed for the well pump. They weren't just attacking. They were dividing. Helen breathed slow through her nose and tapped the side of her rifle once, counting the silhouettes. 1, 2, 3 at the barn, 2 more flanking, the 6th. She hadn't spotted him yet. Probably Coulter. She shifted focus. Kayla was still locked in the storm cellar, safe under 6 feet of dirt and concrete. If the Ridge Unit wanted her, they'd have to come through Helen first. And Helen was done waiting. She reached down, pulled the tripwire taut with a flick of her wrist, and let it snap. Across the property, just outside the tree line, a flare shot into the sky, bright red, screaming like a dying bird. The Ridge Unit stopped mid-stride. One man raised his rifle. Too slow. Helen squeezed. The shot cracked through the night. The man dropped, hit high in the clavicle, the force knocking him sideways into the fence. Not dead, but done for. Panic rippled through the rest of them. They scattered toward cover, but Helen was already moving. She rolled left off the ridge, boots hitting the packed dirt with practiced grace, and sprinted down a ravine path she'd carved years ago, rifle in one hand, sidearm in the other. They'd come for war. She was going to give them one. By the time she reached the south field, the remaining 5 were taking positions. One climbed onto the barn roof with a drone, ready to launch surveillance. She shot the drone before he could lift it. It sparked and spun into the hay bales below, setting them on fire. That did it. Now they knew. Now they were scared. Helen ducked behind the generator shed, checked her 6, and pulled a small device from her belt. An old EMP pulse unit, short range. Jerome had helped her build it from scrap radio gear. She activated it and tossed it behind her. Everything within 50 feet went dark, scopes, comms, watches. The ridge unit scrambled. She heard shouting now, not loud but panicked. Visuals down. Switch to red. Where's 5? Fall back to Point Bravo. Point Bravo was the cattle gate. Old and rusted, but it led out the back of her property into a dirt road they probably had escape vehicles waiting on. She couldn't let them reach it. She moved fast across the south end, cutting across the line of old irrigation troughs, using the terrain like a second skin. She came up behind 2 of the intruders near the barn, both crouched, scanning the dark with red flashlight beams. She took them out with controlled shots, one to the thigh, one to the shoulder. No kills. Life, not yet. Let them scream. Let them know who owned this dirt. The 5th man panicked and opened fire toward the ridge, wasting bullets. Helen let him burn through his mag before creeping behind a tractor and knocking him out with the butt of her rifle. She paused only a second to check for more. Still missing the 6th. Still no Coulter. She circled back toward the house, eyes sweeping every corner, ears tuned for movement. And then... quiet. Too quiet. She stepped around the side porch and froze. Coulter stood on the steps, arms loose, weapon holstered, grinning like a wolf at a butcher's door. "Hell of a welcome, Hayward," he said, voice like gravel soaked in whiskey. "Step off my porch. You always were hard to love. You were never worth loving." He took one slow step forward. "I just want the girl." Helen didn't move. "She's not yours to take. She knows what's under your land. They're going to take it anyway. All I'm offering is mercy. You don't bring mercy with rifles. I bring choices. You brought bodies." Coulter's eyes twitched. "You know how this ends." Helen raised her rifle. "No," she said, "you do." Coulter went for his sidearm. "They're too slow." Helen fired. The round hit just below his knee. He screamed and dropped, rolling off the porch into the dust. She walked over, kicked the weapon away, and stood over him. He laughed, even through the pain. "You still got it. I never lost it." Sirens cut through the air. Not many, but enough. Sheriff Briggs was late, but he was coming. Coulter looked up at her with blood in his teeth. "They'll just send more." Helen bent down, close enough to smell the sweat and fear on it. "They'll all keep count." When the first squad car pulled up, lights flashing, Helen stood in the doorway of her home with her rifle lowered, her lander behind her, the ridge unit cuffed in her field, and the red flare smoke still drifting like a warning across the sky. Briggs stepped out, mouth hanging open. What the hell happened here? Helen looked past him, toward the horizon, and said, "Justice." The sun hadn't even crested the ridge when the aftermath began. Helen sat on the porch, her right arm bound in gauze and duct tape, blood still seeping slowly from the graze where a bullet had kissed the edge of her tricep. She didn't wince. She didn't flinch. Pain was old news. She'd lived through worse in places no one dared name on a map. The ridge unit lay sprawled across the east field, zip-tied and stunned, guarded by a stunned Sheriff Briggs and his 2 deputies, neither of whom had the vocabulary or nerves to handle what they'd walked into. Coulter had already been taken by ambulance, legs shattered, egos shattered worse, still grinning, even as they strapped him in. That was the kind of man he was, one who smiled even when the devil came to collect. Helen watched the deputies stumble through questions they couldn't finish. Did she, do this all herself? "Ma'am, how many shooters were on your side? Was this an ambush, or—" Briggs silenced them with a glance. He walked up the porch steps and leaned on the rail beside her, hands on his belt, face pale. He stared out at the field for a long time before speaking. "I counted 6 rifles, 3 sets of night vision gear, One man had a sat phone. That's not local muscle. That's paramilitary. They were trespassing, Helen said flatly. That they were. Briggs chewed the inside of his cheek. County's already got calls coming in. Folks heard the shots, saw the flare. I'm gonna have to file a preliminary. Make it clean, Helen said. It won't stay quiet, Helen. This isn't just a land dispute anymore. You understand what's coming? I've understood since the first tire track showed up at my gate. Briggs nodded slowly. There's gonna be feds, lawyers, probably corporate pressure from places we've never heard of. Down the road they can come, she said. He looked at her, eyes softening. You got enough fight left for all of them. I got fight and land, and both go deep. He said nothing to that, just pulled a notepad from his coat and began writing a brief report, standing there like a schoolboy beside a teacher he couldn't quite impress. Across the yard, Kayla emerged from the storm cellar. Hair matted, eyes wide, hands shaking. She walked slowly toward the porch, feet dragging in the dirt, as if gravity had gotten heavier overnight. When she reached the steps, she froze, looking up at Helen like a child who didn't know what world she'd woken into. I heard everything, she said quietly. Helen just nodded. I thought maybe you were just, exaggerating the stories, the precautions. Still think so? Kayla shook her head. I don't know anything. Helen gestured toward the empty chair beside her. Kayla sat. Briggs offered her a quiet nod and returned to the yard. Helen leaned back, let the silence fill the space between them. You kept the map safe? She asked. Kayla reached into her jacket and pulled it out, crumpled but intact. Helen turned her gaze toward the barn, where the last of the fire had long since burned itself out. The drone's shell lay twisted in the dirt, half buried in ash. Her land was still standing, but it looked different now. Not broken, just more awake. I'm sorry, Kayla whispered. Helen glanced at her. For what? For bringing them closer, for not believing sooner, for all of it. You didn't bring this, but I was part of it. Helen didn't speak right away. Then, so fix it. Kayla looked at her, surprised. You know their systems, their names, their paths. You've seen what they want. Turn it back on them. I don't even know where to start. Start here, with what you saw, what you survived. Kayla's hands trembled again, but she nodded. Okay. They sat like that for a long time, 2 women, 2 generations, bound not by blood, but by resolve. One had built her life on silence. The other had just broken hers open with truth. Helen stood slowly and walked to the edge of the porch. She watched the deputies load the last man into a cruiser, watched the ambulance disappear down the gravel road, watched as the ridge, her ridge, soaked in the morning light like nothing had happened. But something had. Something permanent. Back inside the house, she opened the drawer beneath the stove and pulled out Jerome's journal. She hadn't touched it in months. Not since the soil first cracked and the wind shifted strange. She flipped to the last page he'd written on. It's not the land they want. It's what they don't understand about it. And what they don't understand is that it's alive. Helen closed the book and smiled. Inside, Kayla had picked up a spade. She was digging a trench near the ridgeline. Not fast, not confident, but with purpose. Helen stepped down from the porch, boots crunching across gravel, and walked out to join her. Kayla looked up, startled. I thought I'd start reinforcing the border, like, a signal. Helen nodded. She took the second spade, leaning against the shed. Together they dug, and behind them the land watched. Unyielding, unbroken, and finally understood. It took exactly 14 days for the suits to show up. They came in black SUVs, parked perfectly aligned at the bottom of Helen's long dirt road. Not on her land, of course. They wouldn't dare. But close enough to watch. 3 men and 1 woman, all pressed into the kind of clothes that stayed stiff no matter how much you sweated. They never knocked, never called. They just stood there, waiting. Helen watched them from the porch, mug in hand, steam curling over the rim like the last bit of warmth a day can offer. She didn't blink, didn't wave. She just sipped her coffee and stared back. Kayla sat beside her, legs crossed, laptop balanced on her knee, typing something furiously. She hadn't slept much the last few nights, but her eyes looked clearer than they had the week she arrived, focused, fierce. Helen glanced sideways. How long you think they'll wait? Kayla stopped typing just long enough to smirk. They're corporate. They've got all the time in the world. But not enough patience. Helen chuckled softly. They brought a drone last night, Kayla said, eyes back on the screen. High res. Quiet. But I picked up the signal, scrambled it, sent them feed from a cow pasture in Montana. Helen laughed, a deep, full sound that hadn't come out in years. I'm proud of you, she said. Kayla blinked. Really? You didn't run? Kayla looked back toward the cars, then down at her hands. I thought about it. A lot. You still can. I won't. Helen nodded once, then stood. She walked down the porch steps, boots crunching against the gravel path, the morning sun laying gold across her shoulders. She didn't carry a weapon, not today. She didn't need one. As she neared the edge of the property line, the tallest of the 4 suits stepped forward. Square jaw, mirrored sunglasses, hair too neat for real work. Mrs. Hayward, he said, nodding slightly. She didn't return it. I'm here on behalf of Proximos Energy Solutions. We understand there's been some confusion regarding land ownership, mineral rights. No confusion, Helen said. You came here thinking no one would fight back. He offered a smile that never reached his eyes. Let's be reasonable. I was, you weren't. There's a substantial compensation package. Earned it. We can still renegotiate. There's nothing left to negotiate. The man's smile finally faltered. We could make this legal process extremely uncomfortable for you. Helen took a step forward, crossing just enough onto the edge of the road that he took 1/2 step back. You sent armed men onto my property. One of them's still in the county hospital. The others are facing federal charges thanks to a certain sheriff who decided not to look the other way. She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice like a rifle being cocked. You come back here with another threat, I won't use the law. I'll use something older. The woman in the group cleared her throat. We're prepared to walk away, she said, if the geological data gathered on the ridge is released to us. Helen raised an eyebrow. You want the maps? Yeah. No, we're offering. You came for what you couldn't earn. Now you leave with nothing. Helen turned and walked back up the path without waiting for a reply. Behind her, the suits muttered, regrouped, and slowly returned to their vehicles. They didn't slam the doors, didn't peel out in frustration. They just drove off. Helen watched until the dust settled. Then she smiled. By mid-afternoon, Wesley pulled up in his rusted Ford, papers stacked on the passenger seat. He stepped out looking like a man who'd slept in his tie, hair a mess, but grin wide. You're officially bulletproof, he said, waving the papers. Why is it? Final zoning resolution. County Commissioner stamped it this morning. Emergency protections added under rural heritage preservation. Your ridge is off limits for any and all commercial drilling. Effective immediately. Helen took the papers gently as if they might vanish in her hands. Kayla stepped out onto the porch with a second mug of coffee and handed it to Wesley. Still hot, she said with a smirk. Wesley grinned. You staying on as her lawyer or her intern? Research partner, Kayla said proudly. Helen didn't correct her. Instead, she looked out across the land. The barn had been patched, the camera wires buried deeper, the sensor flags reinforced. The new fencing Kayla had helped install glittered faintly in the sun, not because it was shiny, but because it had been built with care. Her home didn't feel like just a shelter anymore. It felt fortified, honored, alive. She turned toward the ridge, that old rise of earth that had watched her age and rage and endure. "You know," she said to no one in particular, "this land never asked me for anything, not even once." Wesley tilted his head. "Not even to stay?" "No," she said. "That part I chose." Later that evening, the townsfolk started showing up. Not a lot, just a few at first. Miss Janey brought canned peaches. Old Terence brought some firewood. By dusk, there were almost 20 folks gathered outside Helen's place. Word had gotten out. Not about the fight, not really, but about the stand. That someone had stood when they weren't supposed to. That someone reminded them this land didn't belong to corporations or contracts or clean-shaven men in pressed shirts. It belonged to the people who remembered what it felt like under their feet. They didn't come for gossip. They came with pie, stories, offers to fix the south fence line or help repair the well house. Helen didn't protest. She just made more coffee. When the stars came out, brighter than ever, over the clean stretch of ridge behind her, Helen sat back in her chair and watched them with a stillness only earned through war and waiting. Kayla leaned against the railing, notebook in hand, scribbling something. "What are you writing?" Helen asked. Kayla smiled. "A record." "Of what?" "The fight." Helen shook her head gently. "No. Write about the soil, the wind, the people who showed up. Leave the bullets for someone else's book." Kayla looked at her for a moment, then nodded. Helen closed her eyes, and for the first time in years, she didn't sleep light. She slept like the land did, untouched, unbroken, at peace.